Mic check 1, 2. Yeah, I guess it is. Someone gave it to me muted. Let me begin by saying I'm a little bit sad. 2 weeks ago, we sang one of my favorite hymns, Because He Lives, and we didn't sing my favorite verse. Tonight we sang, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, and we didn't sing my favorite verse. Are you noticing a pattern here? But I'm not bitter. I love Come Thou Fount. I think about that, Here I raise mine Ebenezer. One other thing before we get in. Now I know you just ate. Since last week, time has changed, so it's now dark. Today was a little bit rainy and dreary. And I know that when Baptists get full and it gets dark, I know what happens. But I need you to do like the disciples, just fight really hard to stay awake, okay? Peter, could you just not stay awake a little while longer? Church, tonight, if you know anything about the book of Genesis, you know that chapter 18 and 19, things get really deep in a hurry. This is one of those studies tonight that I come with a very heavy heart, because I think there's a lot in this passage that we can glean from this, and something that we really need to ask. The question is, would God really find a faithful group? Would God find a faithful group? In an article written by Barna Research Group entitled, Openness to Jesus Isn't the Problem, the Church Is. With the general population indicating a warm and positive perception of Jesus, how is it possible that the U.S. is increasingly and swiftly becoming more post-Christian? The answer appears to lie in the dichotomy between how people perceive Jesus versus how they view his followers and the institutional church. They say, and I quote, when we ask Americans whether they have a positive or negative opinion of Jesus, 7 in 10 say they view him positively. Of all U.S. teens and adults, 63% say they have made a personal commitment to Jesus Christ that is still important in their lives today. But church, the question arises, though, why are Christians not viewed so favorably? One of the top reasons in the article, and I quote, is hypocrisy of religious people. The work of Christians is to embody Jesus full of truth and grace and reflect his image in all they say and do. If you have a copy of God's Word to Genesis, turn to Genesis chapter 18. Good news is we will finish Genesis chapter 18. I'm only going to read the first, from 16 to verse 21. Genesis chapter 18, beginning in verse 16. Then the men rose up from there and looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham was walking with them to send them off. The Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all nations of the earth will be blessed. For I have chosen him so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. And the Lord said, The outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great, and their sin is exceedingly grave. I will go down now and see if they have done entirely according to its outcry, which has come to me, and if not, I will know. Told you it gets deep. The motive grows out of the preceding narrative, which stressed that God was able to do whatever he chose to do. But would it be just? The answer to this question was a foregone conclusion which Abraham's intercession demonstrated. After completing the reasons for telling Abraham of his plans for Sodom, the Lord announced that he was about to investigate the wickedness of Sodom that cried out for judgment, an announcement that prompted Abraham to intercede for the city for the sake of the righteous. As we look at this text tonight, I want us to see two things. The first is very simply this: a concern for Abraham and the cities. The concern for Abraham and the cities. Again, we look at verse 16. Then the men rose up from there and looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham was walking with them to send them off. Again, the narrative follows immediately the events of the visitation at Mamre. For once that discussion ended, the men now turned their attention towards Sodom. And all the while, this is followed with two disjunctive clauses. The first reports that Abraham accompanied them in the direction of Sodom. And the second introduces the Lord's soliloquy concerning Abraham. Again, we see in verse 16 that the men rose up from there and looked down towards Sodom. Abraham was walking with them to send them off. We come to verse 17. The Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" What a strong question. Because up to this point, church, we could argue and make the case that Abraham was a righteous man. We can make the argument that Abraham was a man that walked with God. Yeah, there were a few hiccups along the way, but let's be honest. Is there anybody in this room that's perfect? I hope that answer is no. But God asked the question, should I tell Abraham what I'm going to do? Should I let Abraham understand the plan? Because again, there's a double motivation for revealing the judgment to Abraham. The first is very clear. We could come down to verse 18. Since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Isn't this a promise we've already heard repeated multiple times in the book of Genesis? We understood that when we met Abram a few chapters ago, that God had promised, you'll be the father of many nations. And it wasn't long ago God changed his name from Abram to Abraham to remind him of the covenant, just like he changed Sarai's name to Sarah. So we have to understand that yes, Abraham was going to be a blessing to the nations, so an account should be given to him, especially when the fact is the father of multiple nations is fixing to lose one. And so he asked the question, should we let him know, especially when the fact of that one of these nations very likely is about to be removed? And second, I want you to look at verse 19. Y'all, if you haven't learned by now, I love those, for lack of a better term, I love those little golden nuggets in Scripture that God gives you. And sometimes when we're not careful, we get lost in these narratives and we look at the big picture and we just somehow, however, skip over certain things that God could be teaching us. And so, yes, the first reason why God should let Abraham know is because, yes, you're the father of many nations. You may be fixing to lose a nation. But secondly, look in verse 19. For I have chosen him so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. Abraham was to teach his children and his descendants. Now, if you know anything about Hebrew history, this appears again. Doesn't it? Bible scholars, doesn't it? This means yes. Where does it appear? Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 6. This is known as the Shema. Now, you can't say Shema. You got to say Shema. You got to get that extra in it. I can't tell you how the Hebrews do it because it just involves phlegm. I'm just telling you. I mean, that's just what it is. I mean, that's how they do it. I took a year Hebrew. I can promise it's a gift that I don't have. I have to just put my redneck into it best I can. Verse 19 calls for closer examination because it reports that Abraham will command his household to keep the way of the Lord. Can I just take a point of pastoral privilege here? I know a lot of us in this room have kids, grandkids. Let's just be honest for a second. The world that our kids grew up in is nothing like the world we grew up in. And I realize that I'm younger than you. I know some of y'all remember party lines, and you had a TV with no remote, and you had, and folks asked, "Well, how'd you change the channels?" We got up. And you walked 9 feet. But church, let's be honest for a second. You look at the world today and look at the world that you grew up in, they're not the same. But as parents, grandparents, maybe even great-grandparents, God has placed those precious gifts in our lives to shape and to mold and to disciple. And that's what God's telling Abraham here. He said, Abraham, look, we need to let him know because the fact is what is about to happen, his kids and grandkids need to understand that there's a right way and a wrong way to live. And because of right or wrong, there are also consequences to those actions. I told you, I wasn't a chemistry scholar either. One thing I remember was 2 things. Is any acidic thing is offset by a base. And I won't tell you how I learned that, but let's just say it was not good. And for every action, there's an equal or opposite reaction. And the same holds true in our life. If you live by the things of God and you walk in His righteousness, there is a reward and there's a benefit that is beyond explanation. But if you don't walk with Him and you walk in rebellion, there's also a consequence. And God is reminding Abram here, the Lord is saying, look, you must teach these to your household. You must instruct your kids in the righteousness and the justice that they might enjoy God's blessings. Church, there is joy walking with the Lord. There is joy walking in fellowship with God. Do we need to go back to the Garden of Eden before sin ever entered the world and how Adam and God walked together in sweet, harmonious fellowship? And all the while, we see in verse 19 that the Lord knew Abraham. And it confirms the relationship that God and Abraham had. It reaffirms the fact that this was a man promised by God, chosen by God to be the father of many nations. And that relationship has been solidified in a covenant that God will not break. And God reminds us in verse 19, He says, I know him. And I believe with all my heart that Abraham will instill in his descendants exactly what I'm telling him, not only because I've commanded, but because Abraham is a man who lives that life. We can say it this way. Abraham was a man who feared the Lord. And all the while, the second part of this section, the second part of the Lord's speech is a revelation. He says again in verse 20, and the Lord said, the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great, and their sin is exceedingly grave. I will go down now and see if they have done entirely according to its outcry, which has come to me. And if not, I will know. The description is very human-like here. The outcry against their grievous sin was so great that the Lord would go down and see if it really was that bad. First, the word for outcry and the meaning of the word provides a wordplay on the theme of the passage, righteousness. The cry from Sodom will speak of evil, and the response from the Lord will be righteousness. And the Lord announced that He would go down and see if it really was that bad. The point of this, the Lord's judgment is based on full and accurate information. And all the while we come to that word, completeness. That word, the noun completeness, is used to see if they have done completely as they cry of it. He's saying that their deeds were really as bad as the cry indicated. And if they are, what he's saying is, if it's really that bad, I'll be the judge. I'll be the judge to make the final decision. And all the while, Abraham is concerned for the concern for Abraham and for the cities. But secondly, the concern from Abraham prompts pleading. The concern for Abraham prompts pleading. Look at verse 22. The men turned away from there and went towards Sodom while Abraham was still standing before the Lord. Abraham came near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Now again, that's a question. And that's a valid question. Because the fact is, Abraham's concern is if you destroy Sodom, and if you wind up wiping out Sodom, are you going to take the righteous too? Because the fact is, if you were to literally walk in and completely wipe Sodom off the map, and you leave no one standing, how many righteous would be involved in that? And that's what Abraham's asking. He's saying, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Will you indeed take everyone, although there's a few righteous there? What a question. And remember, Abraham's not asking this to his best friend. He's not asking his wife. He's asking God. God, will you really sacrifice the righteous to take out the wicked? Will you destroy the righteous as well? And then if we know anything about this story, now the pleading begins. And if you know the story, you know that for the next few verses, Abraham and God enter into a bargaining agreement. And he begins to ask God all these questions. God, would you do this? God, would you do this? In fact, he says, suppose there are 50 righteous in the city. God, if I can go to Sodom and you can just find 50 people, will you spare the city? And God said, if you can find 50 righteous, I'll spare the city. Abraham says, well, what if I can't find 50? What if I can find 45? Would you spare the city for 45? He said, I will not destroy it if I find 45. He speaks again. What about 40? Are 40 found there? He said, I will not do to it on account of the 40. And as you look through these passages all the while, Abraham literally gets from 50 all the way down to what number? Anybody? See, you read ahead. Good job. I'm proud of you. You get an A for effort. 10 people. God, if you can find 10 righteous people in Sodom, will you not destroy it? 10 from 50, it's a big jump. It's a lot. And all the while, we look down in verse 32. Then he said, oh, may the Lord not be angry, and I shall speak only this once. Suppose 10 are found there. And he said, I will not destroy it on the account of the 10. And as soon as he had finished speaking to Abraham, the Lord departed, and Abraham returned to his place. Abraham was convinced that there were righteous people in Sodom. And that's why he appealed to God on the basis of God's justice. He's not simply praying for Lot to be rescued. The resolution, the negotiation, however, that the righteous would not be destroyed by the wicked finally came by the rescue of Lot. But church, understand, I want you to hear this. God had the right to destroy. That word destroy literally means to sweep away the wicked. But if he destroyed the righteous with them, he would not be just. And all the while through these negotiations, we find contrast between the righteous and the wicked. Accordingly, those who are joined to the Lord by faith and follow his standards in obedience are called the righteous. And those who have no part in the covenant and have no interest in obeying the Lord are wicked. Church, understand, there's so much similarities right here in this passage, it's almost scary. Does it not remind us of November the 6th, 2024? You have wicked, those that have no interest in obeying the Lord. They want nothing to do with the things of God. They're quite content living their life their way. How they define right and wrong is based on their standards, not God's. And that's exactly how they think. And the reality is, that's exactly what wicked is a people that have no interest in obeying the Lord. All the while, the theme of God's justice predominates. Those who enjoy God's blessing must promote righteousness and justice. In so doing, they may appeal to God for just judgment to preserve the righteous, knowing that God would withhold the judgment for the sake of the righteous remnant. Israel and all the people in general would learn that through righteousness they would continue in God's favor. In the interchange between Abraham and the Lord, people would be reminded of God's righteousness as well as the fruits of unrighteousness. 10 righteous people would have preserved unrighteous Sodom. The judge of all the earth will thus certainly do right in preservation or judgment. And all the while, we ask the question, what are the righteous to do? According to this passage, they must live righteously before the Lord in order to enjoy his benefits. They must teach righteousness to their children, and they may entreat the Lord that the righteousness may be swept away that the righteousness not be swept away with the wicked in judgment. I love what Brueggemann said. The capacity to break that scheme which condemns us all and in every city is the substance of God's holiness. God is not an indifferent or tyrannical distributor of rewards and punishments. Rather, God actively seeks a way out of death for us all. What a statement. What a statement. God was willing to spare even the wicked for the sake of the righteous if he could just find 10. Not 50, not 40, not 30, but 10. And all the while we look in this text and plans to destroy the cities is enacted. Only hope is the faithful few. And the question, would the Lord find faithful here among us? Church, we live in a world that is dark. And I'm not talking about because it's 6:30, it's almost 7 o'clock at night, whatever, and time has changed. I'm talking about a world of complete darkness. And the only thing that can penetrate darkness is light. And for us to push back the darkness, we have to reach a point to be faithful. And say, God, would you just find a few faithful? I thought about that word, faithful. And I'm not going to give you what Webster defines as faithful. I had a preaching professor that used to get on to us that don't do that. So I hear Dr. Meeks in the back of my head going, don't use Webster's. But what does it mean to be faithful? What does it mean to be a faithful church member? I have 3. Imagine they all start with S. The one is selfless members. To be faithful, we got to be selfless. It's not about us, it's about Him. It's not about what I want, it's about what He wants. It's not about my thoughts, my plans, my anything else. It's all about His. Am I willing to put me aside for the sake of something that's much bigger than I am? Again, church, a lot has changed over the years. A lot of y'all remember when you went to church, wasn't no padded pews. Wasn't no central air. If you got lucky, you got a funeral home fan. And it served two purposes: to keep you cool and a fly swatter. Either for a literal fly or if your kids were acting up. A lot's changed over the years. Change is not always a bad thing. But sometimes I have to ask the question, is it all about me or is it all about He? And am I willing to put me aside for the sake of something much bigger than I am? Much bigger than my wants, my desires, my needs. But the fact is to be someone that is willing to set me aside for the sake of the kingdom. Secondly, sacrificial members. We're willing to give ourselves. Willing to sacrifice and to serve. Or willing to sacrifice in giving and tithing and being good stewards of what the Lord has blessed us with, and giving and tithing to the church, that the church can fulfill the great commission that God has called us to fulfill. And to begin to reach this city as God has called us to reach. And the next one, you're going to probably think I've lost my mind, so y'all just hang on and buckle up. Serious members. Do we take church seriously? Are we here when the doors are open? Are we actively involved in Sunday school and small groups and call to prayer? And are we actively involved in the work of the church? Or is it just when it's convenient for us? Questions we need to ask. Would God find a faithful group here? And now, before I go on to the conclusion, let me say this. It would be easy to take that question and begin to attach names to that question other than yourself. It's easy to attach and go, well, you know, this and that and the other. But I think the real question needs to be is before we ask for a faithful group, we need to ask the question, am I faithful? Let me share this story real quick, then I'm going to get into the conclusion. We're going to put a bow on this thing and go home. When I was in Amory, one of my members owned a body shop. I'd go by and see him a lot during the week. We'd go play golf some because he knew that I wasn't good at golf and he wouldn't laugh at me. Really, I just went to drive the golf cart. And one day we were on the old Amory Country Club on the back nine, and he reaches over and goes, hey, why don't you read this? I said, what is it? He said, read a book. He said, it's a book. I said, I see that. He said, you need to read it. I said, why do I need to read the book? I said, I've seen it. He goes, you need to read it. And he said, Jeffrey, read the book. I said, yes, Thomas, I will read the book. So I read the book. The book was entitled, I'm a Church Member by Thom Rainer. He said, now when you get done, bring it back to me. I said, okay. Read the book, so here you go. It's a good book. He said, I thought you might say that. I said, then why'd you give me the book? He said, I did the same thing. And then he began to ask some questions that I'm not going to go into. And I kept answering yes. And he said, yeah, I was the same. He said, I thought the same thing. One question I will tell you was, how many times did you think so-and-so needs to read this book? I said, more than I want to admit to. He said, I was the same way. It's easy to say, if just this or this person or that person, and it's easy to divert instead of putting attention on ourselves. For God to find faithful here, we must ask the question, am I faithful? Before I can ask anything of my brother, I'm not picking on you, Carl, but before I can point at I can talk about Carl, I need to talk about Jeff first. Before I talk about Corey, I need to look at Jeff. That's probably a scary subject, but I have the keys. I'm driving, so we'll see. We'll hope how it goes. If I'm not here Sunday, y'all know why. It's much easier to point the blame somewhere else. I came across this article. I want to read this in conclusion. In a Portland magazine, a priest at a Catholic church in Portland, Oregon, tells a story about a street person named Big Ben who came daily to the church. He writes, and I quote, "On Christmas Eve, we decided to have a special cafe evening to minister to the homeless. An unusually large number of people came. At 9 o'clock, we were down to our last pot of soup, though the hungry line still wove around the block. By 9:30, we were down to the last bowl, and there was Big Ben. Face alight with his toothless grin, we filled his bowl to the brim, much to his delight, and that was the last of the soup. As Ben made his way to the table in the corner, a tiny teenage boy whom none of us had ever seen before appeared. He looked like he had slept in the mud. He was shivering for lack of a coat, and his left eye sported a nasty bruise. Since the last of the soup was served, his eyes grew large, and it seemed he was going to cry, but he didn't. God only knows how long he had waited in that line to find no soup. Some of us were reaching for our wallets when Big Ben appeared with his bowl and handed it to the boy. He then put his hand on the boy's cheek and caressed it as a father would caress his sons, and then mused the boy's hair, giggled, and wandered off. It was a tender moment that stood in contrast to the steel, concrete, and cold that too often embrace those without hearth and home. It was a moment that knitted us together a little more tightly and made me proud of my species. And it made me see, maybe for the first time, why God wanted to be human. Could we be faithful? Would God find us faithful? We live in a world that's gone crazy. I've often said, I believe with all my heart we would make Sodom and Gomorrah blush. I feel convicted by that statement. But can God still find faithful? Could God look down from his throne right now into this very room, into our very hearts, and to find us faithful with everything we have? Let's pray. Father, tonight as we look at this passage and the difficulty of it, and the reality of the struggle that we do live in a fallen world. And Father, as we live in a fallen world, we have the only source of hope that they can find. And that's Jesus. Father, are we faithful? Can we be found faithful? And if we're not, as we go home tonight, can we just get in that quiet place in our house, in our home, and begin to do that self-examination and ask the hard questions? What am I lacking? And what is keeping me from being faithful? Is it pride? Is it sin? Is it our selfish fleshly desires? Is it our willingness to not get out of the way and let you be in the front? Is it the fact that we live one way inside this room and outside we live a totally different life? What prevents us from being faithful? And if we're honest and we ask the questions, you'll be honest and give us the answer. But maybe guard against our own self-hypocrisy to begin to make excuses and point fingers and just face the reality of there are things in our life we need to fix. Father, I love you. And I thank you so much. When I read passages like this, and I read the Old Testament, the New Testament, and I look at all the pages of Scripture, I always come back to one thing. And I'm so thankful that you love me enough to give your Son, as undeserving as I am. And so, Father, tonight I thank you to just spend some time in your Word. Keep us safe as we go home. We ask all these things in your name. Amen. I got you out 2 minutes early.